relate that occurred around me in Australia and perhaps in America, as I'll tell you later, which are hearsay from close friends of mine or agents who work for various governments. So from here on, this is hearsay from sources that I do fairly well trust, though. In Perth, when I was there, probably around 1985-ish, 86, we checked the public records there. A newspaper report came out from the Perth newspaper that day, the West Australian, that said that there had been a fire inside ASIO headquarters there in Perth. Now, ASIO is the Australian Scientific Secret Australian Security and Intelligence Organization, ASIO. This fire was the result of apparently an attempted break-in to their headquarters. Well, I read the report like everyone else in the newspaper and thought, oh, gee, that's neat. The secret guy, somebody tried to break in and fire out. Put the paper down, went on about my business. Later that day, I got a phone call from a man that, we'll just call him the karate guy. Used to be the bodyguard, or one of the bodyguards for the Prime Minister of Japan when he was in Australia and traveling in the region. He was an Australian, still is an Australian security officer for one of the security agencies there. Obviously, he had clearance high enough to be inside ASIO that day, because he called me up and said, meet me in the garden at the usual place. I want to tell you something about the break-in today. So when we were alone there in Perth in the daytime in the garden that day, later in the afternoon, he says to me, you read about the break-in and the fire. Yeah, he says, well, what you didn't know was that there was a man killed. He did break in. He got to the file room, and he was shot dead with your file in his hands that we had there. And we kept the file, but we lost the burglary. We killed him. Now, that made me feel pretty terrible that whatever was in my files worth somebody getting killed for, but that's the tale. And remember I told you earlier that I had shelter there in WA from the CIB ASIO guys that were there because they were friendly to my point of view, I guess, and sheltered me from the Eastern States guys. So whether the story is true or not, I don't know, but it seemed like it was, because I know this agent, the karate guy, quite well, and I certainly wouldn't want to cross his path being an enemy. In the intervening years, I have made some friends here in the United States. One such friend lives in Arizona, a businessman who has had contacts clear to the White House in the energy program, very responsible corporate executive. He took my plight, my situation down there to heart, and did everything he could to make life easier and better and to get my story out. I don't intend to name him here, but I'm just telling you that press, when push comes up, I could introduce you to the man and tell you his name and all the details that were necessary in a court of law. He sat at a breakfast meeting in Arizona one morning with Edward Teller on his left, Dr. Edward Teller. He knew he was going to be at this meeting with Dr. Teller because my friend had been asked to, I think, give the morning devotional that they give before their men's meeting there, and so he said he knew he'd be sitting next to Teller on the guest table. So my friend said to me, look, I'm going to take a copy of your book in with me, and I'm going to ask Teller if he remembers you. I said, gee, that'd be great. Let's see what he says. So my friend was sitting next to him, and the devotion came and went, and they were eating breakfast and finished, and so it was a bit relaxed, and he was sitting next to Dr. Teller, and he says, Dr. Teller says, do you know a guy named Stan Deyo that lives down in Australia? And Dr. Teller says, no, never heard of him. He said, that's odd, because he has this book he's written with a letter from Dr. Maxfield on your behalf telling what he'd been doing research for you guys. And when he pulled out my Cosmic Conspiracy book, he said Dr. Teller's face went absolutely drained of blood white, and he didn't answer. And he looked up, Dr. Teller looked up across the table, and several chairs and tables away, and here was an Army general. And the general came immediately over to Dr. Teller and said, look, I'm sorry, we can't leave Dr. Teller here any longer. He's got another appointment, he's got to go, and drug him off. So you can make what you will of that. It does appear that when the hard evidence was put in front of Dr. Teller that he did panic. I don't know whether he had a military minder or whether the military chap was responding to Dr. Keller's silent cue, "Come get me out of this," I'm surrounded by a nut, or what. But anyway, that's as close as I've ever been able to get to getting Teller to admit that we're connected, other than the letter that Dr. Maxfield wrote, which is photocopies of it in the back of my books. It is interesting to note that every one of the names I've mentioned on this tape, as far as I can recall, has been published in my books. I have never, ever received a threat, legally or otherwise, from any of these people. In fact, a number of these people have just very quietly disappeared from the phone books in the towns where they lived and whatever, except for Dr. Maxfield. So it is not a thing that I would be sued over. They don't have enough fear of what I've said, or anger, or whatever, to come and sue. So there must be a little bit of truth in what I've said. As far as I'm concerned, it's 100%. But what I'm trying to tell you is it's odd that after, 22 years of being in print, this book naming all these names, I've never ever been asked to retract or take any of it out, or cease and desist or anything by those that I've named. Over the years, there have been phone calls that were a little bit disturbing to the family, but usually only during times when I was preparing like a documentary once that we did in the States, or when I was about to make a public disclosure. Now, what is a matter of public record is that I brought down to Australia, I brought John Schuessler, who used to work for McDonnell Douglas at NASA in Houston. John's job was the head of an engineering team of several hundred engineers, and he was the space flight operations director for the space shuttle program there. John is an avid student of the alleged UFO incidents and reports around the planet. Very rational fellow, as you can tell from his job description. John had collected probably a ton of paper, a room full of paper and documents and photos over the years about the UFO cover-up. Now, you might find that odd for somebody who works at NASA. In fact, he was often the butt of some jokes around the NASA at Houston because of it. Anyway, I met John in the States at NASA when I was there filming a documentary in '83, I think it was. And we got to be friends, and I said to him, "Look, why don't you come down to Australia, and we'll do a lecture tour, let you air your stuff down there if you can't do it here." So he finally agreed, and we set up a national tour of Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane, in Australia. And we had 3,000 people at our first gathering in Perth, and the unions went on strike just before we were fixing to go on stage, and I had to solve a union dispute to get the lights turned on and the power turned on in the hall. A number of things started to happen as we traveled across the country. A heckler guy called the radio station and tried to imply that John Schuessler had no credentials, no degrees, and didn't work at NASA, which was, of course, obviously a fabrication because he was publicly known to do so. The same fellow, we think, dropped a little doll in our lecture in Melbourne on that same tour. In the front row, he dropped it out of a bag he had, and the doll goes, "Mama!" like that at a critical moment during a very serious topic. Of course, the audience broke into laughter, but it was a way to interrupt or discredit what John and myself were saying at the time. And we started seeing the signs. John said, "I recognize the technique. This is from the States. These guys are not locals. They've been flown in." And so we then flew up to Sydney for the lecture we were going to do there. At about 2 o'clock in the morning in the hotel room, John got a call from a meeting of 3 agencies of the United States. NASA was represented, McDonnell Douglas was represented, United States Air Force, and I think it might have even been DOD, I'm not sure, but at least those 3 were at the meeting. And they told John on the phone that he had a job and a family at home, and home's where he should be right now. If he wanted to stay that way, get on the next plane home and just be quiet. He was embarrassing NASA and the government by talking about what he was talking about. Well, within an hour of that, John developed, in fact, just even 30 minutes after that, a bleeding intestinal problem, and was so ill that we had to put him on a plane anyway and send him home. It was several months before he healed from that. I finished his lecture tour with his notes, but that was a threat, and it was certainly a very significant threat from people that he worked for at McDonnell Douglas and NASA and the Air Force. We were told that if we went to the press with that, and the press were all over our hotel trying to get us at that moment, that, and I don't know how they got wind of it, but if the press got wind of it, that he definitely would not have a job at the Cape or at Houston NASA when he got back. Now, John has since retired, so I'm relatively comfortable telling you this, so it's not going to affect his job. But for all that time in between, we kept this from the press and the public because it would have meant his job and possibly something else. He's a good friend, and I certainly would not do anything to harm him or his family, so I'm sure that he could tell you a lot more of the details that happened to him after he got back, because he got an instant lateral promotion when he got back anyway. But there are tales like this, things that have happened along the way where people have suffered a great deal to get a little information out to the public and then to get swallowed up. The media is an odd thing. It can really hide a story or twist it till it's unbelievable. And that was John on the incident in Perth. Just trying to remember if there's anything else. You might put that on pause for a second. With some technologies that I know work and have developed myself as well. A lot of talk was floating around the United States and Australia and the Western world back in the Reagan administration about a death ray. Well, I actually talked to one of the guys that was on a test of a naval vessel, U.S. naval vessel that was down in Australian waters off the Adelaide coast or South Australian coast in the early 70s, which used one of these so-called death rays to knock out what's called a Gendevic target aircraft drone from 5 miles away. Let me explain this weapon. The comic book writers and the cartoonists have often spoken of a laser cannon or laser gun that you point at some object and you vaporize it from a long way away. The problem is that there are a couple of problems with a laser that punches through the atmosphere and hits a target and then vaporizes it. If you hit a metal object here on the surface with a laser beam that is of the frequency and energy to actually melt the metal rapidly, what happens is a mirror surface forms there. It's called the plume effect. And at somewhere around 80% of the energy of that laser beam, as it strikes a target and forms a mirror, is reflected away. And so it doesn't get it as hot as it should. And so you track down the target. You have little pits of mirror surfaces as it moves along because it reflects, heats like this, and it doesn't rip the target apart. So they devised a way to make a laser beam that would ionize or excite nitrogen in the atmosphere. When the gas of the atmosphere becomes ionized, and nitrogen had 3 or 4 levels of ionizations you could use, I think, isn't it 4, something like that? The nitrogen can conduct electricity, and most gases can if they're in a plasma state. So they wanted this laser beam to go to the target, making a wire in the atmosphere of the ionized gas. And over the surrounding that laser ionized channel was going to be pulses of donut-shaped or smoke ring-shaped charged gas at high temperature. Now, these donut shapes spin like that, forward in the center and curling around the back, just like a breaststroking donut going along this laser beam to the target. And the idea behind it was that they would send a lot of these high-voltage, high-current plasma rings along this wire to the target, which is just a laser beam, so that when it got to the target, it would scoop out the metal that melted and throw it to the side so it couldn't reflect the beam away, and it could tunnel right in and cut a hole in the craft, which it did. It was quite effective. The cameras to photograph the test of the firing of it on the naval vessel had to operate at 50,000 frames a second to capture the toroids leaving the cannon. So we did have that, and it was being shared down in Australia at that time. I'm familiar with the technique, but the same technique can also be used. Instead of making a weapon, you can make, with a minor adjustment to the whole thing, you can make an antenna that goes from the ground out as far as you want, and you can transmit and receive data along this ionized channel in the atmosphere. And it's a portable antenna that can be, 2 miles long if you want, straight up or straight out. there are a lot of peaceful applications for it, but unfortunately, because of war and what other things, it had to be classified. So we do have that, and I am aware of that one, and I'm planning to use some of that myself in a peaceful application rather than for weaponry. The concept of toroids is a fundamental thing that has been left out of our physics books for the main part until the last 10 years. I have seen that the University of Texas, or University of Houston, I think it is, anyway, in Texas, I think it's in Houston, there has been work in aerodynamics utilizing what I'm about to explain to you. I have no problem explaining this to you because having built craft using what I'm about to tell you, I know there are two factors that you don't know about until you build one that will not compromise my patent at this point. It will not enable you to build one yourself without a lot of heartache. But the concept, I will tell you. Asymmetric propulsion is completely opposite to symmetric propulsion. Symmetric propulsion is where you have thrust reaction. The Newtonian value of where you have a rocket, it shoots gas plume out the back, but it moves the opposite direction. This is a symmetric propulsion. Mass out the back, mass the opposite direction. Asymmetric propulsion is where you can take your object, shoot mass ahead of it, and follow it. You go in the same direction, so it's asymmetric propulsion. My original patents that I filed in Australia were under a thing called a vortical insertion accelerator, or a VIA drive, VIA drive. And that was for a marine application of what I'm about to explain to you. Asymmetric propulsion is something you see in life quite frequently and never pay any attention to it. Every time you've seen a bumblebee flying, you've seen asymmetric propulsion working. In aerodynamics, they teach in the universities the bumblebee cannot fly, but God forgot to tell him. And the understanding of why and how he can fly is a marvelous piece of understanding of the entire, the basis for what makes the universe run. This is why what I'm about to tell you is more than just propulsion. It is new nuclear physics. It is an understanding of how energy exchanges throughout the universe in multiple parallel universes even, as Einstein did postulate. When you have been in the garden watering with a water hose, and you've been tired of watering, and you stuck the water hose on spray down into the soil, especially if you had sandy soil, when you've stuck it into the ground, you've noticed, I'm sure, that occasionally it will tunnel itself into the ground. You get it just under the dirt, get a little bit of mush around it, and your water hose head sucks itself into the ground. What you may not have done is take a big bucket of water and take this water hose and the nozzle, hold the hose maybe 2 feet away from the nozzle so that there's a lot of leverage on that nozzle, and turn it on spray, and it's dancing around like this. The nozzle, you're dancing around, and you think, wow, it's like a rocket. It's shooting the water out here, and it's bouncing the head up here. Now, in my bucket of water, if I just let the nozzle on spray get right under the surface, right there, just as it clears the surface, it sucks itself to the bottom, like a rocket in reverse. And you say to yourself, wow, that's neat, why did that happen? So then you look at standard physics, and you say, well, the flow of water created a Bernoulli or a Venturi effect underneath it, and it sucked itself toward the bottom. Well, you would be correct. You think, well, that's novel, but what good is that for propelling something? Because you don't have a bucket wall ahead of you to fly with. But you do. If you've ever been in a boat doing 15, 20, 30 knots, put your hand out into the water, what do you feel? It rips your hand off. It's hard. Inertia forms a wall. So there is a way to generate a hard wall ahead of a craft and use that to create an entrainment, a breaststroking, so that when you pulse that spray of water ahead of you, or spray of air, or spray of electromagnetic field, as you pulse it in thin film, it comes back around and into your intakes of your prime mover and recirculates. Over a period of seconds, your wake is recirculated, approximately 75 to 80% of it, back into your intakes. So your power requirement drops to 20 to 25% to get the same velocity, same speed. Using this, you save energy, you can go a lot faster because you are not shoving your way through the media. In Einstein's view of relativity, in Michelson-Morley's observations of the change in the velocity of light, and in the Lorentz-Fitzgerald transforms that try to explain foreshortening of mass and time dilations because of the observations of Michelson-Morley, there was a mistake, and it's a very simple one. These things I'm telling you are all found in the back of my first book, The Cosmic Conspiracy. I lay out where the information is available in Dr. Scalma's book, The Physical Foundations of General Relativity, and I explain where the error occurred in Einstein's observation as well as Michelson-Morley. And Michelson-Morley did correct this in 1925 in what's called a rotational analog of their experiment. All of these things, from one simple error, we grew a tree of physics that limited us. We couldn't go faster than the velocity of light. We had trouble breaking the sound barrier because of the inertial waveforms that breaks the craft, and you know, the extreme, huge amount of power required to go faster and faster than the speed of sound. The error occurred like this. Here's a cup of tea or coffee. You spin it, you stir it. It has tea leaves in it. Now, if you imagine that the center of the cup, where it's spinning, the little vortex, is the sun, and that out here around it, spinning around it, are tea leaves, are planets. Then you have the situation that Michelson and Morley were in when they said, look, we're going to shoot some light out ahead of the Earth as it travels along, and split a light beam so that half of it goes this way and half of it goes out at right angles. And so when it comes back, this beam here, as we're moving, will have traveled a long triangle like this, where this one will have traveled a shorter distance, and they should come back out of phase. Well, it didn't happen. They were expecting to sit on their tea leaf, the Earth, and since we were obviously moving through the tea as we orbited the sun, that they would be able to get some change in the velocity of light sideways versus going forward. They found none. As many times as they did the experiment, they found none. Now, their premise was flawed. They were saying we are moving through the fluid of space. They did not consider the fact that the tea was moving us, and we were moving at the same speed of the tea in our vicinity. So, when they discovered this later, Michelson and Gale and Michelson and Sagnac later, they made a spinning disk, and they split the light beam going with the spin of the disk and against it. And they found such a tremendous evidence of light variation, or light speed variation, that they were able to navigate a battleship from beneath, from the midships, from beneath deck, without any outside like horizon or any methods of telling where the battleship was. They could navigate that battleship by the interference rings that were forming on the go-return of the light in a rotational analog. Now what this means is this. You've got your water hose that's spraying water out like this and it curls. If you are not shoving your way through water, air, or any field, then you are generating a definition of, say, like in physics, of like a gamma ray, a gamma photon, or a tachyon, if you go faster than the wave velocity of the medium you're in. Because you are not shoving up this huge inertial wave, which you do when you shove a rocket or something forward, because you're not shoving out part of your inertia in a curl that comes back at you, because you're shoving it behind you, sideways, you create a definition of a low pressure area in front of you, a high pressure area behind you, and your entire craft becomes like a wing, except the whole top surface or forward surface is your lift or negative pressure area, and the back of it is your positive pressure area. It's like the old mail chute devices they used to have, 50 years ago in offices, where you open up a chute and put the little bullet with your message in it and suck it up the tube and somewhere else into the building. In front of it is a vacuum, behind it is normal air pressure, so it shoves and pushes it along. Now, I've made a number of videotapes and tests in a laboratory with oil vapor and high-speed smoke ring cannons to explain this to other folks, to explain what's happening when we're building something. The faster you spin or pulse air into a smoke ring, get it off with your water hose now, and just pulse air or water into a donut. The faster you do that, the more defined that object becomes as a solid. We've been able to shoot these toroids in air and in water to create them and shoot them at up to 100 miles an hour, and they will bounce off of solid objects. They become like a particle, which is why in physics we have evidence for wave behavior at a subatomic level and particle behavior. In essence, there are no solid particles. There are only fluids or inertia spins in a fluid space medium. You can call it whatever you want to, ether space or fine structure, but it is still treated as a medium in which there are vortices, balanced pairs, imbalanced pairs where you get photon movement or travel in the thing. And if you build, in essence, a large imbalanced vortex, like a donut, then you have the mechanism for a flying saucer or a super submarine or electrodramatic craft. Gravity itself does not exist on any system or in any system without spin about a moment. You will not have a gravitational constant without spin. You can estimate the gravitational constant very closely of far stars, distant stars, by the oblateness of their spheroid. Instead of being a perfect sphere, they flatten, and that flattening tells us the angular velocity of the star, and we can determine from that, by the 6th power, I believe, what the gravitational constant is, because it will not have gravity without spin. On a nuclear level, the mass here and the mass in my hand, they do have an attraction, but it's the sum of all the little molecular spins, and there's a net force there because of that in the field of the Earth that we're in. You can have anti-gravity, if you wish to call it that, by generating electromagnetic fields at lower frequencies under a kilohertz, and by overlapping two flat coils and pulsing them so that you generate what Michael Faraday was looking for in the beginning, which was a magnetic capacitor. A static capacitor, a voltage capacitor, is static because voltage is a potential rather than a traveling current. To have the equivalent of a magnetic capacitor, you have to have a dynamic circuit, which means you build something that stacks, and it is a dynamic storage, like rings or shells of inertia, which pass through this coil and then through that one, and they're interfaced by a parametric buffer. So you pulse into this one, and just as you're pulsing into that one, it stops. You pulse into this one, which is carrying the last current you pulse plus the one you've got, and you can stack up a huge field. And our average 30-foot diameter craft could generate a field that went out 800 feet. To generate movement in a gravitational field like that, you have to have spin in your craft and or in your field of the craft. And that's where the vortex comes in. You spin the whole lot in like that and around like that. So your donut doesn't just spin like that, it spins this way as well. Once you do that, it's a slight slip in the phase between the two, and you can bend inertia. You can do it with a gyroscope, a couple of gyroscopes, one out on a stick and another on the edge of it, and you can get the same effect where it weighs less, but it's because of the spin. You're just diverting the inertia of the fluid that drives all the mass together. Gravity does not have a one-directional force, say like on the Earth. If you were to drill a hole to the center of the Earth and drop a rock from the surface, it would not go down to the center. It would go down a few hundred miles and hit an inertial shell, a null shell. It would drop through it and bounce back and come to a point where there is a zero inertial gravitational force, because there are shells of gravity, as far as we can discover in everything. Does that make sense, guys?
Mm-hmm.
Is anybody...
Okay.
Now, take the case of the bumblebee. I did mention that. Let me explain how the bumblebee works. The bumblebee aerodynamically is a disaster. It's not streamlined. It's got drag problems everywhere. It's bulky. It's clumsy. You watch a bumblebee. Next time you see a bumblebee, sit and watch that guy take off. He'll leap out a bit, spin his wings. He just leaps a bit and spins his wings, and he forms a ball of air around him. And he moves by changing the direction of that ball of air. He recirculates part of his wake. He spins, he articulates his wings like this and spins a wake around him, this ball of air that has a low pressure definition in the direction he wants to go. They are clumsy because as they come along and decide, I'm going to land here, they say, well, I got to break the bubble now. So when they go to break the bubble, they crash, and you'll see the bumblebees crash land. That's why. They have to break the envelope before they can land. They aren't streamlined. Do you understand what I'm saying now? The secrets are there. They're everywhere in nature. Take the salmon. Oh, the salmon swimming upstream. If you've ever watched that closely, you thought, how can a salmon swim not only upstream, but up a waterfall and over it? Short waterfalls, they can go straight vertical and over them. Now, they have found that the way they do that is It's by opening their mouth and their gill structure and forming a vortex which helps them get over the hump. They use the flow of the water. You can tack into the wind at 180 degrees. Do you understand what I'm saying? You can tack straight into the wind, not at an angle, straight in if you use an entrainment device like we're talking about. And the salmon has one, that God put there. He can do it with his gills and his mouth. And his tail and his fins. He does all that. But he doesn't have enough energy without taking the energy of the waterfall to curl in there and form that vortex. Watch it. Read it. The salmon is a mystery. But it is there. It's just an amazing thing. With there are just so many things. With the concept of toroids, these spinning donuts, you can make changes in nuclear chemistry. Instead of say having fission or fusion reactions where you break atoms apart or where you mash them together and shoot things spinning off like that, conceptually there is a way to slow down the spin or to interface to the spin that creates the particle and wind energy out of them at a discrete rate. And in essence what you do is like the alchemist's dream, is you transmute an element down to lower energy elements by strip mining the energy from it. But this would require frequencies like probably in the 40 gigahertz range and tune cavity things to actually strip mine the energy by peeling it off like an onion skin. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So there's a heap of things that can be developed from just the simple concept of knowing what a torus is and how it affects subatomic physics. Take a tachyon. Now, Cherenkov, the Russian physicist, said that the blue light coming out of the water in the nuclear piles, the nuclear reactors, that blue light is called Cherenkov radiation. And he put forward the theory that, or the hypothesis, that there were hyperlight particles being produced in the water by the nuclear reactions, and that as they went hyperlight this way, that the shock wave at right angles was Cherenkov radiation, light, blue light. Well, in our experiments with smoke rings in a lab, we did something that verified in our mind that what he said was absolutely correct. You can go many times faster than the speed of light, warp space if you wish, by bending it. We did experiments like this. We put a candle 16 feet away and light it over there at right angles to us, say about 10 feet ahead of us. And we have our target impact area for our smoke ring cannon we built. We would fire that smoke ring cannon, bang, to go hit the target over there. And 40, 50 feet away, it knocked something over. As it passed, only as it passed that candle at right angles, the candle flame would do this. It would suck toward the path of the toroid and back. There was a right angle shock wave that went with it, bang, like that. And the only evidence of that smoke ring passing was a shell, a tube of smoke that unraveled behind it. And so then we had to do high-speed photography, dissect the smoke ring, see what everybody else had done in researching this. And you see that there is inside the smoke ring, as it's moving that way, and this would be the center of it, that the incoming air combines here and comes back in and forms a loop, a filament down here like this, to the very center where it forms like a yin-yang, or yin-yang, was it one of those, the Chinese life symbol. It forms one of those where the actual incoming air from ahead of you chases the smoke back out in between, and so it leaves a smoke trail here, which you started with. The smoke ring disappears. We notice it disappears halfway to the target. You can't see it because it's got a refresh of air. It's a warp in the atmosphere, or in the air, or whatever medium. It's a warp that takes the energy and exchanges what was in the smoke ring plus what it goes through. So it's like in a carpet where you put a ripple in the carpet doesn't go anywhere, but the ripple does. And that's one kind of toroid. There's another which is a dynamic one, which is constantly being pulsed and refreshed, and it doesn't have the layers. It does a different thing. But all these things change our whole view of physics and how we can get stuff out of it, how we put things into it, and energy. Energy. Everybody's been looking for that 0-point energy you're talking about. Call it whatever you want to. What happens at a molecular level is there's a lot of little spinning gyroscopes, balanced, imbalanced, photons, which are half of a gyroscope going that way. There's not a balanced torus there. This is chaotic, random motion. And if you take the example of a yacht on the lake, this is a special lake in, let's say, a volcanic area with hills around it. And there are odd breezes that will blow from here for 5 or 10 seconds and then stop, and another one from over here. Peculiar wind structure, but breezes come from all directions at odd times, random breezes, and you want to raise your sail to catch those breezes to move you in a particular direction on that lake. Well, you're clever. You've got a little infrared scope that lets you look ahead of the breeze and say, here comes a wave front. I can see by the thermal barrier on it, it's heading our way. Set the sail, grab that bugger, right, got him, and take the energy, drop the sails. Where's the next one coming? There he is over there. So if you can selectively grab wind or energy coming your way at a molecular level, random particles, and vector that energy into a single course, then you can do what Maxwell was talking about, and you can get the fast particles over this side, the slow particles over that side of the little Maxwell's Demon Gateway. You can store that. You can move in a vector that way. And that's what thermionic conversion is you take random motion of mass, molecules, preferably in the infrared range for the chemicals that we use, and you take that randomness, and every time that randomness in a snapshot of a second hits some electric particles that are in a fixed pathway, an oscillation here in a circuit, every time they hit that way and add energy to the particles going this way, that extra energy on the electron is then expressed as a voltage gradient, which you siphon off with a diode and an arc gap perhaps, or at least a diode. And when you do that, you take energy of motion out of the mass over. You cool it, in essence, by the lost energy that you converted to electricity. When it says, I want some back, the circuit says, I can't do that because my diode won't let me take the energy back. But I'll sure take anything you've got coming my way. So every 40 millionth of a second or so, as these things are vibrating, a certain percentage of that population is striking your plate, thermally, motion-wise. And that motion added on to the moving electron is what you convert as electricity. And if you do that, you can then power your flying saucer, you can power your car. The car goes along with using one of these. If you built one, the top of the car, the bottom, the side, something will be taking heat out of the environment, converting it to electricity, which is then put into your wheels. As it goes down the road, the friction generates heat right behind you to put the heat back, and in the air from the resistance of the wires you're using in your motors. So in essence, you pump energy that's normally coming from the sun or some other heat source and flowing somewhere else. You interrupt that flow and say, look, flow through me and turn my wheels. I'll give you the energy back in heat. And so your net balance on the environment is zero. You like it?
I like it.
I'm going to build one of those.
Okay.
Yeah, you understand, for 30 years, I've been kind of in exile down there on the Strait because of all this crud where they tried to just get me out of the country. I think that Teller and Maxfield came to me not because I had any ideas that were new and wonderful. They came to me because they were afraid that I would start, patenting these things and getting backers in the United States, and suddenly America would know about the new technology. It would compromise the overall game plan that they had. And as far as I've been able to deduce, here's what the game plan is. You want to hear that?
Sure.
Okay. Sometime back around 1948-49, a group of men in Europe and the United States and England decided that we couldn't afford another war. Globally, it would be a disaster. But that we had to have a global government of some sort. Because if we kept having diverse economies and resource distribution and certainly uncontrolled birth rates in certain countries, that we were going to overpopulate ourselves and die. To preserve the planet, they said we had to have a world government, a world economy. Everything had to be globally managed. In the States, Dr. Gordon Gray, the man who set up the Cyber Warfare Division of the CIA in the early 50s, was one of these men. Now, I was able to determine that he knew about this thing because he was friends with Agnew H. Bonson, Agnew Hunter Bonson in Salem, North Carolina, of the Bonson Company. Now, I was privy to the Bonson Company's files, correspondence files for Agnew Bonson. He's now dead. He died in a plane crash in 62, I think it was, 62, 64. Dr. Gray was an advisor to several presidents, including Eisenhower. He was the Secretary of the Army. He set up that Cyber Warfare Division for the CIA. These are all matters of public record. He was a friend of Agnew Bonson's. Agnew Bonson wanted to set up a world government by inventing a flying saucer, an electric flying saucer, keeping it secret from the public, making a fake alien landing, and thereby fooling the masses, more than the governments, but the masses of the world, into thinking that elder brothers from space with no political or no religious alliances had arrived. A clean slate. And then they would propose a world government structure which everyone would follow because they didn't want the alternate, which would be fighting a superior technology so superior that it was better than any plane, rocket, or gun that we had on Earth. They had reasoned that we could not negotiate a peace. They had reasoned we could not force people into peace because that generates resistance groups like the French did in World War II. So they were going to coerce people with this fake alien landing. Reagan said it, what we need is a landing of little green men. The Prime Minister of Australia, Bob Hawke, said it, what we need is a landing of little green men to bring people together. Now, Agnew Bonson wrote a book. He was a CEO of a Bonson company. He wrote a book in his spare time called The Stars Are Too High. And I think, was it Bantam or Sphere, Booksphere, or somebody like that, published a book. We've got a copy of the book, one of the few remaining. In there, he proposed a Council of 8, which he later called the Council of 12 in his personal notes. So the book, in his book, he had the concept of the Council of 8 and the Council of 12 to make this scientific fake alien landing. And his objective was to collect world leaders and scientists into this, this paradigm so that they could finance such a project. Now, to put his money where his mouth was, Agnew Bonson then hired Townsend Thomas Brown and set him up with a laboratory, which I did visit after they closed it down and put it under lock and key and concrete and iron doors. But they set up this lab to make flying saucers with high voltage using the Byfield-Brown effect. I have their lab notes, which the Bonson family did allow me to extract, plus about an hour's worth of 8mm film without sound taken in the lab day-to-day tests of the flying saucers that they built there, the small discs and things like that. Now, they didn't solve the problem, but Bonson was trying to impress Edward Teller, who was on his guest list. I found that in the notes that he and Teller talked a couple of times over this and the need for a fake alien landing. Then there was the Bryce and Cecile DeWitt, the mathematician, husband and wife pair, who he set up, Bonson set up a fund for them at, where was it, at North Carolina? Anyway, there's a Bonson Research Institute that is still going today that he funded, he endowed, and they were the ones that were running it. I have a copy of a letter he wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt for help, to Nikita Khrushchev, to Albert Einstein. Agnew Bonson was trying to get them to pull this deception together. Now his friend, and he was a friend, was Gordon Gray. Now Gordon Gray either took the idea and ran with it, or was already doing it and just didn't tell Agnew. But Dr. Gray survived Agnew. Agnew, yeah. Now, whether Agnew was let in the loop or not by Dr. Gray, what did happen is that Agnew Bonson went out for a proficiency flight on his single-engine aircraft from an air base there near the home where he'd flown in and out of many times. And he went off, as he went off on the flight, he came over his home and dipped his wings to his two sons who were out in the front yard. Dipped his wings, saluted him in essence, and flew off on his proficiency flight, and then came back to that same base and attempted a landing with a full nose tank, which he had warned people consistently never do at this airport because there are power lines stretched across the approach, and if you clip your wheels on the power lines, you'll go down and you'll burn in a ball of flame. He landed at this airport, he hit the wires, and the nose tank was full, and he was consumed in flame and died. Now, was it an accident? I asked the family, what do you think? Oh yeah, it's an accident, but it is unusual that Dad had told everyone else not to do what he did, and he comes back and he dies at the airport in a ball of fire. You can see conspiracy everywhere you want, but it is odd that he published the book that he wrote to foreign heads of state and our own head of state at the time, and our leading scientists, trying to get them to pull together a fake alien landing, and Gordon Gray, was an MJ-12 member. I'm reasonably certain. I can't prove that, but he was the initiator of the idea of this fake alien landing. A mini version of this was proposed for the Bay of Pigs invasion, to project the Madonna up in the clouds and drop pamphlets over the Cubans and say, when you see this in the heavens, this sign, then know that you're supposed to support the troops to come in because they're coming to liberate you, so forth. It never transpired, but it was a mini form, a small form of a global deception in which alien beings would be presented purely as technological devices, appearing like in the movie 4th of July or Independence Day, or like the movie V, the series V. Somewhere along the line, this went underground very rapidly, and Bonson was left out of the loop and then died, and his book kind of died with him. It just went very quiet. Townsend Brown I talked to before he died a couple of times, and we corresponded. He never succeeded in getting his saucers to work because they were basically static electric charge devices, not dynamic. One of the other fellows that was working, and a brother-in-law of Agnew Bonson, working at the lab at that time, was J. Frank King of Salem, North Carolina as well. And J. Frank patented a polyphase ion accelerator disk, or flying saucer. When he filed the patent in 1962, I believe it was, he was visited at his home by two men in suits from the government. He came to him and said, J. Frank, you will cease and desist work on this polyphase saucer craft you've tried to patent until we give you further notice. We've put it under a special classification, and we don't want you to do anything to it or develop it or try to do anything further until we clear it. And he said, well, what will happen if I decide to do it anyway? And they said, if you do, we'll do bad things to you. And that was his quote. J. Frank waited patiently for 6 years, and finally said, I've had enough, I want to play with my craft. He got a hold of the patents office, and he said, look, your guys came in, or somebody did here, and said, I can't do this. Will you please release this, or, get off the pot, I'm going to do it. And they finally sent him a letter back and says, okay, yes, we'll let you do it, you can have the patent, and proceed. He never did any more with it because he'd gotten a little bit older at the time and had other things going with his life and business, and he never was able to complete it. As it was, his device would have been a brute force device and not an entrainment toroidal craft like we ended up building. So it wouldn't have been as efficient. I ran over his numbers, and he'd made a mistake even in his prime mover horsepower requirement for it. An easy, simple mistake that was corrected. It just meant he had to have more prime mover power than he had put into his patent. I had his working notes, which were in his personal effects and the family gave me, and that's how I know what he did. That dissertation wasn't in the patent itself. Okay, anyway, so there you see an example. Again, he told me that direct. In fact, he told it to me on camera. I have a video of that somewhere back in Australia, where he told about the two guys coming out saying, we'll do bad things to you if you try to work on this patent before we tell you it's clear. Strange enough, I heard the same story from a man in Dallas, in Mesquite, Texas, in 1971, before I myself left the country. I picked up a local newspaper from Mesquite, which is outside Dallas, a little thin, Mesquite Times or something or other. On the front page it had, Joe Blogg's local man invents flying saucer, going to launch it, and scale models of it and showing it on. I looked at it and I thought, gee, how could that work? He's got, the vectors are all wrong, but he says he's going to fly it around his barnyard pretty soon. So the guy was only a couple miles away, so I rang him. I said, look, can I come over and have a look at that? Oh yeah, sure, come on over. So I get in the car and I whip over to this guy's house, and sure enough, it's a barn. And I get in the house there, and I'm in my suit because I've been at work, and he says, are you with those other fellows, are you? And I said, what other fellows? The guys who just left. The ones that said that they have to be present for me to test it. I said, no, I'm a different fella. Did they say what department they were with? I thought, well, we'll play this for what it's worth. I said, not from my group. And he said, oh, no, well, they said that because of national security, something or other, when I do test the big one, that I have to tell them they have to be present for the test. He said, oh, isn't that interesting? Can I see your device? So I looked at it, and I realized that it wouldn't fly. It'd hover. It's a good hovercraft, but it wouldn't fly. And the whole point of that story is that before I could get there on that phone call, they must have seen the same newspaper. There was somebody in suits that come out to him and said, look, call us when you're going to test it. We want to be present. Fascinating, isn't it? Look, I'm sure I'm forgetting heaps of things, but it's been a very busy 30 years. But I do intend to release a lot of this now that I realize that these guys planning this global deception, they themselves, as Sir John told me, which I didn't tell you, in 73, Sir John down in the Melbourne Club group, at that time revealed to me that some stronger group than them, some bigger, tougher group, was moving in and they were losing the fight against them. And he never said alien, but understand this group was multinational, so it had to be something supranational. And I can only assume it was alien. I've never met an alien to my knowledge, anyway. I've certainly heard rumors of them from a number of intelligence people and things I've told you about in the MI6. And the Roswell event, a very odd little story, I'll tell you this, but it may mean nothing. When I was about 15 in Dallas, outside Dallas, in Garland, I think it was, which is close to Fort Worth, the sister city, where there's a SAC base at Carswell. I was visiting with another teenage friend of mine, a third teenager. This is back in 1960, 61. And we were sitting there trying to one-up each other with the best ghost story or the best I done this, super thing story, like young guys do. And this third teenager that I had just been introduced to, living there in Garland, said, well, I've got one that tops everything you guys can talk. My dad carried an alien from an alien crash back here to Carswell on an aircraft. And we said, oh, yeah, right? He said, no, I'm serious. Now, I'm not fooling. This is a true story, guys, he says. Dad showed me the little gear thing. It had like 9 divisions. It's apparently these odd number of divisions around the gear structure is very hard to make or tool to get it right or something. I said, well, I don't know why that is. And he said, well, and then Dad showed me this piece of metal that came from the hull, and it was like you could take a knife blade and you could peel off layers of this metal. It wasn't glued together, but it stuck together, and you could peel off layers. So we laughed, and we said, well, that's a good one. You almost got us, but no prize. And time passed, and I forgot this. Till about 3 years ago, I guess, when I was listening to Art Bell on the talkback radio here in America over the internet. And Art Bell is saying, folks, I've just received this parcel in the mail from someone saying he sent me pieces of a crashed aircraft, spacecraft from Roswell, and I don't know whether it's real, but here are the photos. I looked at the photos on the internet, and I saw the layered hull. It was like a bismuth, bismuth and magnesium, was it, or bismuth and aluminum? Aluminum, and bismuth layers. And certainly bismuth has some very unusual electrical properties, which would, you could use layered bismuth and aluminum. But the thing that impressed me most was that the material could be peeled off. It was layers, just like this kid had told me about. And of course, the story of Roswell says that it came out of New Mexico by flight to Carswell Air Force Base. And so, did it happen? Did the father see the aliens like he told his son? Well, it's hearsay. But it's another little piece of the puzzle that maybe fits together. On the thermionic exchange, the cooling effect to generate electricity, there was a young fellow who later became an engineer in New Mexico where that thing came down. He was with a scout troop or something like that, fossicking around the area. His name was Barnett, I think. In a filmed interview that I saw of him, he related that his troop, like they were kids, and had come up next to a flying saucer crash. In the middle of the day, it was hot, and there were some alive and some dead aliens laying around. And one thing that he noticed is he was told to step out of the way as the adult scout leader, whoever was with him, was talking to another one. The young fellow Barnett was over next to the ship, and even though it was hot out in the sun, the ship was cold. And one of the aliens was like laying down, but still alive against the side. And he looked at him and felt vertigo, like he was falling as he looked at this alien, as though he was trying to communicate with him or something by mind. But the thing that impressed me was that the craft was cool on the outside. Thermionically, when you draw the energy out, you form an electric flow, electric sink to a heat source, and it will cool the outside while it's gaining energy. So, to me, that fragment of information from Barnett does support a thermionic power source for these. If you are familiar with the Area 51 story, who was the young fellow that came spilling it all about the sport model stuff? Who came forward here recently, 3 or 4 years ago? Oh, you know his
I
name.
just saw it the other day.
What's his name? You know the young guy that was taken out from Nevada there, and he built the race cars. He was in the newspapers, and then he saw the sport model super flying saucers out there, and we all tried to figure out whether he was telling a lie or not. Gee. Out there, you know who this fellow was. Anyway,
You say young guy.
yeah, well, reasonably young.
Oh, I could think was one of them.
No, not. No. This is he was the darling of the talk radio set for a while there, telling the secrets of Area 51. Anyway, this fellow reckoned that he was shown the UFO, the crashed UFO, and that it used element 115 to power it. And he said that they had a particle beam that would hit this, and it would generate heat, and this heat was then used to generate electricity, and you had to have element 115 or you couldn't do it. Well, that's bull dust. But the part that he described about the thermionics was certainly true as far as I can determine, in that you have to generate that heat source relative to your outside sink so that you can then let the heat flow into electricity to extract it as moving electrons rather than spinning or translating subatomic particles. What is that guy's name? Anyway, so that part of it, again, there's someone else talking about the thermionics in the drive, where they use heat converted to electricity for thermionics. And you're familiar with thermoelectricity. I mean, it's been known for a long time. The Russians have probably been the leaders in it, where you get dissimilar metals, put them together, heat the junction here, cool the junction there, electricity flows, or conversely, put electricity into it, and it will cool one junction, heat the other, into dissimilar metals. Dr. Schrodinger wrote a paper on the possibility of frequencies, wave fronts, being the factor that control the amount of conversion at the junctions of these dissimilar metals, saying that it would be possible to increase the efficiency if the frequency were matched better in the coupling of the metals, and there was an artificial frequency put in there across the gate. Sorry, Heisenberg did that one. I think Heisenberg proposed that, not Schrodinger, Heisenberg. But anyway, all of them are moving toward efficiencies in thermoelectric conversion. So we know that thermal processes in conductors can be made to convert directly to electricity. All we're saying here is that there is a way to extract the energy much more efficiently and much more rapidly using tuned cavity resonators and triboluminescent interfaces to the infrared frequency of molecular motion. You know, it's a natural band.
Okay.
Two, go.
Should
Okay.
we change